Hello, welcome to the podcast, Giving Back is Dead. We're trying a bit of a different format today, which is a video conversation with two great professionals to discuss the topic of how the market drives giving to the arts. I'd like to introduce my two guests, Johanna Burton and Allan Schwartzman. Johanna Burton is the Maurice Marciano Director of the Museum of Contemporary Art, having arrived at the beginning of November. Burton has been active in the contemporary art field for more than 20 years, including more than a decade of leadership experience in major museums and prominent arts and education institutions. Allan Schwartzman has provided short and long-term bespoke advice to collectors all over the world, guiding them in the formation of their holdings in modern, post-war, and contemporary art. He is founder and principal of the art advisory firm Schwartzman Ann. He has been a frequent guest speaker and panelist at institutions and events around the world and has written extensively about art for publications, including The New Yorker and The New York Times. So let's begin. 2020, I want to talk first a little bit about the art market in general and how it impacts, how I see it's impacting giving. 2020 was the highest recorded year of giving in the United States in all sectors. However, giving to arts and culture declined by 7.5%, and it's only one of two sectors that declined in 2020. Today, only 4% of total giving in the United States goes to arts and culture. However, some statistics indicate that the global art market declined 22% in 2020 as compared to 2019. Preliminary 2021 art market figures indicate a return to a vibrant art market. As such, can you anticipate that we will see an increase in giving in 2021 in line with an increase in the art market? Feel free to talk, either one of you.
I'll start as the market person. I question how to interpret those figures in part, primarily because at least half of 2020 and virtually all of 2021, most cultural institutions were closed, theaters were down. It was very natural and pragmatic that funding would have slowed down in the absence of audiences and public programs. Not necessarily as a matter of taking an ethical or moral or just personal priority stance in relation to the arts, but simply because there weren't the reasons to spend certain significant sums that ordinarily would have been spent in those years. So I question a little bit how much that information provides us. Having said that, I think certainly we have seen reason to believe and understand that there will be challenges moving forward for many cultural institutions. And that, of course, offers the opportunities for institutions to rethink the very premise behind their fundraising, what they're raising funds for, and how it is that their institutions are perceived in terms of serving a public. And if I may just say one additional thing, museums are and have become central civic institutions. But many have not fully recognized that or programmed up to that or adapted both their relationships to their audiences and the way they communicate what it is that they do. And so I think the museum that embraces that role more openly and consciously is in an ideal position to prove to even a broader audience or quote marketplace of their essential relevance to society.
Johanna?
I'll just jump in. Everything Allan said actually resonates with things that I'll say. And I also will back up and say, though you called yourself the market person, it's really interesting, and maybe we'll get to this point too. We come from a space that's actually pretty shared in terms of institutional understandings and historical reference points. And there's something interesting to be said about that too. On paper, that we've gone these different trajectories, but in fact, there's quite a lot of shared terrain. So perhaps we'll get there too. this point of really pointing to the next phase of what museums can and should and will be as civic institutions, I think, is key to this conversation in pretty much every way. The movement towards serving a broader public, there's been a lot of talk about that over the years, but I think really only over the last couple of years has that become centralized. I think hires like mine actually speak to a shift in the ways in which museums are prioritizing that work. Prior to this position, I was at the Wexner Center for the Arts, but before that, I spent my entire career as an educator, a curator, but also an educator. And a lot of that work, while I think quite valued, was also siloed. I think that work is now being distributed throughout museums in a particular way, and it puts pressure on exactly the kind of questions that we're here to describe and discuss today, which is funding exhibitions. Yes, people love to do that. They love to see what they are collecting and thinking about in the studios that they're visiting, represented on the walls. But I think more and more it's important to kind of point to an expanded context for how philanthropists and supporters in general can invest in and engage. So, Allan, to your point, I've been looking a lot at, and I'm not the first person to say this, but I think it's really interesting. There are two sort of civic institutions that were imperiled and seen as on the kind of precipice of obsolescence for a long time: museums and libraries. And it's libraries that have made this really fundamental shift towards a kind of different functionality in a democratized space. Now, I look at them and I think, do we want to become a library? Probably not. I think museums do have to continue to think about what their definition is, but libraries are a place where people used to think about it as a space that was elite. It was about higher learning. People now go and they eat there, they check their email, they watch movies. We could talk about the complicated politics in a way for some people around that shift, but it does, I think, allow for a kind of conversation about museums that are starting to move more into that space. The skeptics could say that that's just a new version of the experience economy, and maybe we can talk about that too. But I think this question that you're pointing to in terms of value is really, really important. I'll say one more thing, which is that though the pandemic, I think, affected the giving really substantially in the ways that Allan is talking about, it was also, at least for me, some of the busiest museum work I've ever done. We were providing constant programs for people. There was a avid appetite for art and culture. Most of it was done virtually, and most of it was done for free. So I have some concerns about the way in which, though there was an appetite for and a desire to intersect with culture, it was done at a distance, and it was done, and it's funny, I feel a little bit odd saying this, there was no transaction involved, which is a wonderful thing, but it also means people got used to not paying for certain kinds of programs as well. So maybe we can talk about that as we move along.
Yeah, I think, of course, all these points are relevant, and we don't know yet if, as you say, Allan, is it because the museums were closed? But you sort of said two things. We don't know, but there is a structural issue about what the museums, how the museums are presenting and what they're offering people, which is, I tend to believe that's the issue. And that's what I see when I'm talking mostly to younger people. And I think if people like Johanna begin to present what they're offering in a different way, I think that's what's really necessary. We've seen in general over the last, I think it's about the last 5 years, that while giving has not necessarily gone down, the total portion of giving to arts and culture has been decreasing. And, mostly giving has been parallel to the financial markets, which is why essentially 2020 was so high. And I think many of the larger institutions did get substantial contributions. Well, that's the only, I'll try and stay out and just let the two of you talk, but I just wanted to say, I think the question is more structural, and I think it's more what both of you had said in the end.
I would add to that what you're suggesting here, which I believe, is that what we're also experiencing is the beginning of a generational shift.
Yes.
And so how a next generation of wealth, at all different levels of wealth, values the institution and engages with it is indeed, it's in need of some change and shaking up, which parallels the needs in rethinking or closely examining governance decision making for programs,
Absolutely.
the interconnection between curatorial and education, as Johanna already spoke about.
Yeah. I think these are the key issues. As I'm talking to the next generation of people, this is what they're telling me. And when there's this resistance to giving to the arts, this is what they say. These are the issues they want addressed.
I was just going to add that something that was, it's probably in a way so evident, but we should bring it up, is that when I was speaking with philanthropists who were sort of dedicated, long-standing philanthropists during the pandemic and during the racial reckoning too, which we can't hold apart, one thing that often came up was this idea that I found troublesome, but is I think pervasive in the context that we're talking about, where people said that they were needing to give to basic needs rather than to give to culture. It's something that I would push back pretty heartily against as somebody who's been in education for many years. Art and culture is a basic need for people, particularly at times like the ones that we're living through, and how to have that conversation. I sometimes found that it was a convenient modality of talking about decisions to give, particularly because those same people, and I'm not talking about anybody in particular, were reaping great benefits as the market was higher and higher for a small percentage of people than ever before. But I did want to point out that there's a kind of reversion to this idea of basic needs living outside of culture and outside of education, actually, interestingly enough, at a moment where I think there's a more widespread understanding that art, at least as I experience it and as I like to run a museum that provides it, is more outside of its walls and more within a larger social context than ever before. I think there's a plus side to this moment. It really is that more people are engaged in and go to museums than ever before. Now, what they're going there for and how they support is a different story.
I think that's exactly right. If leaders like yourself, Johanna, talk about it being basic needs, this is what is necessary, and I believe it is a basic need. So we have to be promoting giving to the arts in that way. So now let's talk a little bit more specifically about the market's impact on museums, artist-endowed foundations, and other arts nonprofits. And first, if we focus a little more on museums, I'm going to read a couple of provocative quotes which reflect a little bit about what I'm hearing when I talk to these next generation people. The first one, quotes that I've just seen recently around. The first one is by Brad Trummell, and he says, "Museums have become akin to credit rating agencies controlled by wealthy trustees with vested interests in promoting work stashed away in free ports until the next transaction, that is." And Kenny Schachter, who said, this is a little part of a much larger quote. He said, "Venerable institutions are getting their hands dirty too, like London's Serpentine Galleries, about how to stage a sure-to-be box office busting exhibition of Cause, the Picasso of crappy collectibles. If that isn't reason enough to withdraw your support from Hans Ulrich & Co., I don't know what is." I think, Johanna, you have to say something about this, because this is in line a little bit about what I'm hearing from next-gen potential donors.
Yeah, I mean, it hits on both quotes, hit on something kind of interesting, which is at the same time as we're demanding that we throw the doors open and we really kind of question some of the hierarchies upon which museums were built, we're also drawing lines around in the sand around value. Like, that happens in those quotes, right? Like, we should be constantly rethinking how and whether people are in relationship to a canon that was established in a really kind of very clearly elitist sphere. But then we also want to hold on to that, myself included, by the way. I should speak very honestly about the fact that there are these kind of internal parameters that I hold myself accountable to, and they're very easy, I think, to step over the more and more embedded in popular culture artistic production becomes. And I think when you speak with younger donors and artists too, they can be extremely savvy in terms of art historical reference, but that's not always the first reference that people are making. I think as all contemporary art does, we are looking at artists and people who are responding to the cultural climate that we're in. So I guess I would respond and say, I will remind, by the way, I'm not defending any artist here, but I'll remind us that, Leo Steinberg, one of the best art historians in my mind ever, thought Jasper Johns was terrible when he first saw the work, and it was because it disrupted certain ideas of classical art. So, as somebody who has spent most of her life in the contemporary sphere, I feel like it's a really interesting fine line between kind of opening these doors and really thinking about different modes, but also how do we think about crossing those lines? And again, I feel very subject to that, because at the end of the day, I don't want us to be vying for. We're not the same as a movie theater necessarily, although sometimes we are that too. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question fully, but I do think we're pointing at a paradox. That's a really interesting one in terms of, frankly, class, maybe more than anything else.
Class on a variety of different levels.
Correct.
Yeah. Allan,
I'd
anything
be
you want
curious.
to say?
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts. The first one very much echoes what Johanna just said, which is I never really connected to the work of Murakami. Then I was coming to Los Angeles. There was a retrospective that was mounted at MOCA. Maybe it was 15 years ago, thereabouts.
Yeah.
And I turned to Tim Blum, who's someone who is his art dealer and someone with whom I have long-standing respect and dialogue. And I said, Tim, I don't connect to this work, but I know that you understand it well. Would you please walk me through the show so that I can perhaps see the artist in a different way than I was naturally framed to see it? He took me through the show. He spoke about maybe 8 specific works in the exhibition, and it completely changed the way in which I look at that work. And so I think it was very natural and not deliberate that museums grew in a way that corporations grow, and that it mirrored, in fact, the same arc of development and growth within the art market. Now that we step back and look at it, we see the challenges that has produced. And we're now at a moment of reset. And it's not, in some cosmically fate-driven way. It's perhaps not it's not coincidental that this happens at the same time that the world kind of stops and we reach a kind of point, a breaking point politically, societally, and we all have time to step back and think. So I really think that what people do with the knowledge that has been gained during this period and how they rethink various structures by which institutions operate and how they're funded, and really, as much as that, a consciousness amongst patrons as to what patronage means and can be. And I think there are probably a lot of things that museums did in the process of growing that perhaps oversold certain components of the museum. And perhaps a lot of this was based upon a notion of a quick solution, or an appealing way to bring in funds. But I think a lot of that is very much open to being rethought. I think at core, the majority of people who patronize museums truly do believe in the long-term enterprise and health of the ecosystem of art.
I hope you're right. I think these are the issues which absolutely must be addressed, particularly for the next generation. So can we talk a little bit about, do you see a difference in the art market's impact on giving to modern and contemporary art museums as opposed to historical or encyclopedic museums?
I'll be very curious to hear what Allan says. I've only ever worked in contemporary art museums, but as I mentioned, I've done so from a space that was always sort of tasked with happily expanding an audience. So thinking about the ways that people who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves the audiences of contemporary art, which, by the way, seems to be the most off-putting for people. It feels, interestingly, though, contemporary art is the space in which artists are reflecting on their own conditions, and so it would seem to be a space that was open to all. Most people that I have intersected find it to be, as opposed to, say, to sort of antiquities or 19th century art, to be the most hard to crack. I'm not sure it is so different. I think a lot about scale, actually, and the way that people give to scale. So if you are a patron of the Met, you give a lot more than if you're a patron of, the Studio Museum. Yeah. Although these days, it's interesting to call attention to that example because I think the Studio Museum has done such an amazing job over the years of being very clear about a mission and being very clear about the impact of not only what happens in its walls but outside. So maybe a better example would be, the Met and MOCA, where I am now. Right, there's a scalability that in some ways. Yeah. Potentially has to do with the distinction between being a contemporary art museum and being more of an encyclopedic one, but I think it also speaks to how people think about themselves relative to the scale of museums. I don't know, Allan, if that's it. Maybe I'm shirking the question, but I don't think I am.
No, I don't think you are. I think that most people who enter into arts patronage enter as collectors, and they begin collecting the art of their time. So there is a direct relationship between contemporary art and giving. And so what we see is more and more historical museums taking on contemporary programs and trying to find ways to connect to both those audiences, which may, in certain cases, as Johanna suggests, be smaller or more befuddled. But that's where the money is. I mean, years ago, I wrote an article on the collecting of contemporary art at the Metropolitan Museum during the era in which Bill Lieberman was the head of the contemporary art department. And if you looked at his history of acquisitions, it was appalling. I mean, he had no idea what contemporary art was. He was buying extremely conservative third-generation British figurative painters and had no connection to any notion of an avant-garde. And so I wrote this piece, which was not very... let's just say it was very critical of the museum, but I remember interviewing Philippe de Montebello, and this is a museum that historically avoided contemporary art. There were all sorts of reasons. Some of it, I understand, was rooted in notions of class and who it is that collects contemporary art, which often meant new money and Jews. I can say this as a Jew, sorry, So it was not a museum that openly cultivated it. It just so happens that in the 60s they had Henry Geldzahler as curator, who was one of the great curators of contemporary art of his generation. And then in the later phase, Tom Hess, who was a brilliant critic and scholar, had become the head of that department and died just a few months into the job, which is when Lieberman was appointed. And so I remember interviewing Philippe de Montebello, who was the director of the museum at the time, and what he said, and this is almost a direct quote, or it's a good paraphrasing of it, I think, is that that we will not, as a matter of will, cut ourselves off from the funding of the future for museums. So he basically was saying, we don't care about the art, but we care about the money that's associated with the art. So I think that is certainly inevitable, and there's a direct link. I think the way history is being re-examined, or is just on the precipice in the case of many museums, to being re-examined, positions a lot of historical work in a very contemporary context. So I think this whole issue of where the money comes from in terms of interests and how that relates to markets, I think that is likely to change substantially. And even some of those areas of collecting that are historical, that are being brought into a relationship with contemporary art and being rethought in relation to contemporary thought, are also areas that are becoming increasingly challenging and perhaps illegal in which to be collecting. So I think you're going to see a lot of kind of movement of people and supporters.
I was just going to say, I think something that you've both brought up that's really important, that I'd also, as somebody who believes deeply in contemporary art and loves to be around artists, I do feel like the shift for every museum to be putting all of its emphasis on contemporary is somewhat of a shame, because it starts to feel like, and this happened actually, I studied it to be an art historian as well, and the same thing happened actually during my my time as a graduate student, where Rosalind Krauss wasn't allowed to write about a living artist, and that's not so long ago. And now people are struggling, departments are struggling to find Renaissance scholars. And so I would just say that as much as I love contemporary art, I think it is very much following the logic that Allan talks about, but to the detriment a little bit to a wider sphere. And to some degree, I think that one of our biggest challenges is reorienting people to see contemporary practice within a longer line of historical ideas. So there are times where I really wish for that kind of framework and for the interest in it. So I'm not shining light on anything that's super revelatory, but it is true that the interest is following the money in that way, and I think sometimes that's not such a good thing.
And what you're suggesting in terms of opening it up, I think it not only opens up dialogue and broader public interest potentially, but it also can bring, or would likely bring, greater discipline to what is at the moment a very frenetic and somewhat chaotic process of collecting the very new.
I agree.
Also, I just wanted to go back to one of the things that Allan mentioned, which is the origin of the funds, of the donors, which has become quite a sensitive issue, as we all know, particularly, I think, for next generation donors. And since he brought it up now, I would like to hear what you have, how you deal with this issue, Johanna.
Well, it's another complicated situation, right? Where, I'll say that I've been in museums for the last several years where I think appropriately people are asking questions about the internal workings. How are people paid? How do we think about the discrepancy between frontline staff or curatorial staff and other staff? But then at the same time, there's a desire for equity that I very much support, but then there's also the desire to get rid of what is seen as an outmoded kind of history of philanthropy that itself resides in class structure. We can't do it all at once, and I think, if we were to again look at something like what happened with the PPP money that came in during the pandemic, I think people saw that as the beginning of a model that honestly should be applied more broadly, but probably won't be. So I think the tension, and I'll answer your question specifically about tracing the money back, the question resides in a tension that, to use your earliest question, is purely it's a systems-based problem. As long as we have a really completely unbalanced economic structure in the United States and in the world, we'll have a mode of philanthropy that to some degree mirrors that. But it is interesting that we're being asked to be vigilant about tracing, and I think it's actually an interesting conversation, who we take money from, how transparent we are about that, and where the lines are drawn. I think in some cases recently it's been very clear that you can't take money from certain people and you shouldn't, and I think those are really useful conversations. But I worry at times about how productive we are about producing new scenarios for philanthropy, and what it means to truly diversify funding for institutions as quickly as people are asking for it to be done. So I guess that would be my answer. Yes, we should be doing all that work. I think that we should be asking questions of our patrons. I think that we should be working with our boards to change the funding structure. But I think it's going to take some real decision making on the part of everybody involved to get that done.
But you're hopeful.
I'm always hopeful. I feel very fortunate and lucky to be in the seat that I'm in. I didn't come out of a conventional upwardly mobile background where I ended up in the humanities and could work for free as an intern. So I'd love to change that so that we are paying people and we are changing those structures. But at the end of the day, we still live in a society that has a lot of, I think Allan said this before, the last 2 years have been instrumental in changing the dialogue and starting new ones, but we'll see where it all goes. And I think in the meantime, we also have to be very mindful of the ways that people do believe in institutions and that they give in different ways to supporting those institutions and acknowledging those different modalities of support.
Great. Can we also talk a little bit about the art market's impact on specific types of donations to a museum? How does the market impact donations to fund special exhibits, the purchase of art for the museum permanent collection, for participation in acquisition committees, donations to the operating budget, education, and endowment? I think you have to begin, Johanna.
I'll say something quick because this is my experiences, again, not in any way generalizing, but I'll tell a story, which is I was lucky enough to go through the CCL program, which is the Center for Curatorial Leadership program, where you not only learn about sort of philosophies, but also about the business part of museums, which most of us don't learn until we're put into positions where we have to oversee them. And we met with the CFO for MoMA, who said, it's so interesting, right? Like there's so much money in their acquisitions fund. Like everyone wants to give to buy art, to have their name on an exhibition wall, but operations is, of course, the place that this is needed. So I can say, having worked in education, that foundations love education. Some single donors like education. Operations is never. I just saw that an anonymous donor gave Mass MOCA $4 million for HVAC, and I thought, whoever this person is, please come join my board.
Of course.
But I guess I would just say, that is what you're putting your finger on is precisely the kind of I think observational change that we need to see happen, where people really think that it's as valuable or more valuable to be giving to things that just keep the doors open. And I think there are ways to acknowledge people for that too. But yes, people really love to buy and give work and to be part of that process, I think, for all the reasons that we've talked about. I don't know if you have other feelings about that, Allan, but that still remains the case, I think.
I think that that there's been an unfortunate kind of slow shift in the kind of profile or mobility or range of independence of thought that has taken place within the community or amongst curators of major museums and museums that are ones that we would call primary institutions within the mainstream, meaning that as the cost of exhibitions has gone up, it's become increasingly difficult to buy curators free space in which to think beyond into realms that have not been processed through the art market. I think in the 1980s, when this growth of institutions and the art market really gained force, the market became very efficient at adapting to or finding place for almost any kind of art. Sometimes the most challenging art that required the most space became particularly appealing for many private collectors to collect. But that really started to narrow down greatly toward the end of the 80s and into the 90s. And so it became a necessity that curators would, particularly for major exhibitions, thematic exhibitions usually tend to be the least popular to fund, the ones that have the smallest audiences, but that also are where the real thinking for the field evolves. So we find fewer exhibitions like that. We find more exhibitions that are solo retrospectives or surveys of artists who have been pretty widely embraced over a period of time. So I think that kind of slow shift happened over decades within museums, and it was a direct link to the cost of doing things. I think what I found was that a few very kind of curators who needed to be active left institutions and worked in a freelance way. And in many cases, that produced some really interesting and wonderful shows that would not have happened otherwise, sometimes on a freelance basis for museums and sometimes within private venues. And then you found some smaller, scrappier institutions that became that much more committed to rethinking or thinking in a truly contemporary way. And there I would credit the new museum as almost always maintaining that course. Johanna comes out of the new museum. I came out of the new museum once upon a time, which Johanna kind of referred to obliquely at the beginning. Um, and in I would say over the last decade, many of the alternative spaces that were formed in the 1970s and that were vital to exhibitions of art in the process of it becoming, of ideas being developed and worked out, that became more often than not, became somewhat irrelevant in the 80s and 90s, and that were seeking growth in a way that didn't really build upon their strengths. That over the last decade, so many of those have rethought their programs and how they make decisions and who their audience is. And so I think that it's the smaller institutions that have been able to retain that sense of testing and adventure and working in ways that don't embrace the market. And oftentimes, those are also the same places that collectors who are interested in art as it develops tend to patronize. So, not always, but there's just all sorts of ways in which the market has impacted both consciously and unconsciously our institutions. Sometimes, oftentimes, to the limitation of the institution to and to the limitation of the audience. But also, in that there has been a greater popularization of museums in the good sense of it, in terms of access points and understanding art and contemporary art in particular. And I think now, museums are going to be even that much more challenged in the next few years on how they address issues of budget, expenditure, what you need for what programs are created that continue to serve the institution while adapting to what for most museums is a very significant longer term loss of revenue that needs to be made up in the coming years.
I would just say, too, and MOCA obviously is a place that has a history of having engaged in those kinds of thematic experimental projects that Allan is talking about. It was one of the great reasons that I was so committed and excited to come here. Something that gives me great hope, as it's probably been made clear throughout this conversation, I'm excited about going back to some of those premises, not that any of us ever really left them, but re-engaging them in the present. They won't look the same because it's a different context, but I'm super heartened that as I've taken on this role and even before, and certainly in the work I did at the New Museum and other places, artists really want this space right now. It's not very available in very many places where you can come in and you actually do R&D. You spend time working out something that isn't just about coming in and hanging a show. So I think more and more museums, as opposed to other cultural institutions and particularly galleries, which have an increasing role in presentation of work, I think this is a space that we can provide both for audiences and artists, which is exactly what Allan's pointing to, a space where it's not all about a resolved object necessarily, although if you're really engaged in an artist, you don't need that necessarily to find the satisfaction of engaging in the work. So I do think, interestingly, as we come out of or go into the next phase of where we are, that's something I hear again and again, is a real hunger for that kind of deep engagement with an institution and the kinds of support that go along with that, not just financial, but also curatorial framing, also critical. We haven't talked at all about the state of criticism, but having art historical and critical writing around a project and linking it to other either artists working or artists in the past. So I think that this is actually a really exciting time to re-engage institutionally with some of the things that actually I think were the kind of level set and foundation for a lot of the institutions that we're now seeing in midlife, such as MOCA and the New Museum.
I would just add one final thought there, which is that we're in a very different moment for very contemporary art than we were a few years ago. And the kind of programming that Johanna is speaking about that she foresees in the near future, I think it's mirrored by and is called for by the art of today. I mean, we have a much wider range of what art interests artists across the board. And so I think what we're getting further away from feeling obliged to narrow things down to add a few names to the canon.
Do you think, it makes me think what we're talking about is also, what do you think about, it seems to me that many of the European institutions have an easier time. I would love, obviously, my background is with Centre Pompidou. And it would seem to me that because of the difference in the structure of their funding, exactly what we're talking about, it has been easier for them to address these issues. What do you think?
Well, in those countries where the funding still remains robust or meets needs, absolutely.
Yeah.
If you don't have to spend most of your time finding new ways to generate revenue and to appeal to donors, you can really focus on your programs. And embedded in a notion of ongoing funding that is legislated or that comes from the town, the state, the nation, is this underlying acknowledgement that culture is central to daily life. And so it puts a lot more respect on the institution and its specialists in terms of programming.
But we have seen a shift, because like you, I remember early on living in Paris and coming back to LA to see MOCA's groundbreaking exhibits. You could not come, if you wanted to know what was really going on, you had to come to MOCA and see what was going on. And that seems gradually over the years, you see less and less of that happening, except at some exceptional institutions, which still are larger in scale and probably have more diversified funding.
Virtually all of the thoughtful thematic exhibitions curated over a 20-year period were curated by MOCA.
Yeah, yeah. But we'll touch a second again, if you don't mind, on the pressure that museums have from their collectors, museum trustees, and potential museum trustees about exhibiting the hot artists and the artists they collect. Can a museum keep its trustees if it refuses to exhibit the artists major trustees are collecting?
I mean, I can give a very short answer because I've worked here for 3 months. I have not experienced any inordinate pressure from trustees, although obviously there are conversations, always organic ones, about what's happening and the sort of role of the museum in stepping forward at particular times in careers. But until now, I've actually worked at non-collecting institutions. And this is a very, very different, though not entirely separate, way in which people proceed, depending on whether or not you're building a collection or you are simply showing work. So, and again, I feel very lucky to have not had that kind of pressure. I know it exists, but for the most part, I think if we're talking about institutions where there's the proper kind of governing distinction between roles, that shouldn't happen. It's probably famous last words, but I don't think so. I haven't experienced anything myself, though I've heard lots of stories.
Bon. Allan, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, it kind of echoes what I said earlier, which is I think we're at a moment where we're looking at assessing opening up to contemporary art and what it can be is fundamentally different than even 5 years ago,
yes.
Certainly than 15 years ago. And so we're at a different moment that requires that is best served by thinking differently about how we look at it and assess it. So I think that this is a moment of great potential for opening up. And so I think it just takes at most a few conversations with some funders and board members that may not be on the same page to kind of open up to them a world of the very contemporary. And then I think therein you naturally create a path for looking differently at what is exhibited, what the larger society values, and how that ultimately fits into collecting. I think also if you look at the funding of major foundations, very wealthy ones from wealth that was formed over 100 years ago. You look at Mellon Foundation, which has substantial financial convening power. The money that they're doing some of the most enlightened funding within the arts today, and their focus is primarily on the artist and making funds available directly to artists. That has to have impact in a wider sphere, both to other foundations, to institutions, and to the information that then gets shared with the support groups.
Can I just add a comment too, which is I agree, and I think Mellon and Ford, we can look at the ways that they're actually paving the way for what it looks like to fund ethically and transparently. I think what is of interest, though, to me, is that we rarely talk about the fact that they too are imparting value, just as anybody else would, right? The artists who receive that funding are visibly being given a kind of platform that is part of the overall construction of what we're describing here. And that my only fear, and this is not a fear that I think lends itself to anything except admiration for these foundations, is I want to make sure that institutions themselves aren't seen as dispensable, because we've been there before historically, where I think the museum is as a vessel and as a site is maybe more precarious than it's been, at least in my lifetime, and needs to be rethought but also protected. I'm an institutional creature, so I really, at the end of the day, I want our museums to survive. But I do think that as we're questioning the parameters, we need to also be conceiving the institution as not the thing that's inherently the problem, although it's often the problem. So I just want to mention that I think we are at a kind of an interesting moment for thinking about there are many, many ways that people have gone around institutions when they aren't functioning properly. And now I hope that we can also come back around them, because I do think they have an important function.
And I do see there the greatest opportunity in forging new paths to newer wealth that is that's looking at art and culture and society in different ways. And this is about messaging, programming, communication, and so on. So I think that's where the greatest opportunities lie in terms of validating, reinforcing, and in some cases repositioning programming and how it defines the institution and how it defines the institution as a truly public space.
I couldn't agree more. You probably saw the article, I think it was in ArtNet a few weeks ago or a couple months ago, that said there are more vacancies in directorial positions than ever in history, because it's such a hard job right now and because there is such a lack of faith in institutions. And so it's an interesting moment.
I think it depends. We're all saying the same thing. It depends on leaders like yourself and its trustees of the great institutions to be able to convince the public that they are indispensable civic institutions. This is what it's about, which they've been forgetting this, I think, to some extent. But I think we're all saying the same thing. Okay, if we can talk a few minutes more, I wanted to get your input on how the market impacts artist-endowed foundations, which are becoming increasingly important in our infrastructure.
Well, this is probably one of, if not the most transformative field that is going to be becoming more and more visible. There was a massive increase in the population of artists and the notion of how an artist could function in the generation immediately after the abstract expressionists. So that first generation of artists, the first wave of baby boomers, are now in their 70s and 80s, and many are no longer with us. And even when one looks beyond the names of the artists who have been the biggest names within a marketplace in collecting, there are nonetheless many highly significant bodies of work, either work of direct notable value today or places where that are of great lasting value and therefore markets that can be developed. And so we're going to see a huge acceleration over the next 20 years and beyond of a great increase in the base of funding to the arts and other essential causes that are of interest to artists through either the foundations that they form or the estates that they lead. And so, this is in my work, we've been increasingly doing more and more advisory for living artists and estates. Precisely, this comes out of as much my engagement in the market as my history going back to being a curator when there wasn't a market, so to speak, for contemporary art. Is just recognizing that there are a lot of needs out there in terms of artists and estates, in terms of conceiving of how to be most effective with the objects to which they're responsible, and which many of which have great historical value and potentially significant financial value.
I think it's actually really exciting, and it also points in a direction of how the ecosystem can feed itself in a way and actually shift itself from within, which I find really moving and actually really exciting generationally to see that kind of loop. I'll say that just even in my most current circumstance, we just got a really important grant from the Frankenthaler Foundation for the work that we do around climate change, which for me, that's the kind of exciting moment where it all kind of comes together and makes sense and allows for different kind of work that in and of itself, I think more and more artists are looking to make that kind of impact and change. And if there's that kind of undergirding by foundations that also reinscribes the importance of how artists function and perform in this space, it's great. So, and I have to say, even artists of my generation who are starting to or have seen a lot of success are turning to that really early, much earlier even than I would expect, and thinking about how to be planful to ensure that there is a kind of righting of the ship, which is really lovely to see.
I would add also, I've been on the boards of several small-scale alternative spaces or arts institutions, and consistently the greatest support always came from artists, and it particularly came from the generation of artists who are indeed now in their 70s and 80s, and some of them no longer with us, who saw the value to frontline arts organizations that were embedded within the embryonic realm of nurturing, displaying, interpreting, and supporting art at its very base. And so that is indeed a great fundamental foundation for it. I think if you also look at the Warhol Foundation, that was transformative.
Absolutely.
In the funding field.
Yeah.
And so he was probably the first very significant artist of his generation to die and to leave massive value and wealth. And that they now are, I imagine, they've been for many years the most prominent, or give the most money to exhibitions of contemporary art of any entity, in way eclipsing the National Endowment for the Arts a long time ago.
It was also, I think, such a smart indicator that artists also realized. We haven't talked that much about supporting, you started to allude to this, Allan, but artists directly supporting artists, who the generation that you're speaking of, artists had to actually organize and make the argument that they were workers at all and that they should be paid at all. And I don't think we're out of that realm still, though I think things have improved vastly. So the kind of grassroots nature of artists sort of opting to make that labor visible and to underline it, I think is again, both good for institutions, but also a good reminder that when we're talking about philanthropy in the market, we are talking about workers.
Yes.
We're talking about workers who, for the most part, unless they're part of that very kind of particular 1% that make a lot of money, don't make a lot of money, many of them at all. So I would just want to point that out too, in terms of this history that we're sketching out.
So finally, the last topic is the same thing, talking a little bit about other arts nonprofits, such as art schools, residency program, grants for research for writers. I think that's a little bit your area, Johanna. What do you think the impact of the market is on these other arts nonprofits?
It's interesting. I mean, again, I'm going to go back to scale. I think the scrappy stay pretty scrappy, except in a few finite examples. And I think that's where this kind of logic of where we're talking about the market, it's in a very particular, very visible kind of sphere, but it's often not engaging with what's going on in the ground. And I think actually that's one place we can really work with, boards and philanthropists who are really excited and engaged with what they see as contemporary art, but might be one small piece of it. So something about LA that I love, for instance, is this is a city that I've always admired because it's so deeply embedded in the educational complex here.
Yes.
There are amazing artists who teach here because it's part of what they see as their overall practice, not something they have to do necessarily to pay their rent, although they do that too. So the short answer is I think that we have very different, when we're talking about the art world, we're talking about very different spheres that sometimes don't intersect at all. I've lived in that sphere for a long time of residencies and education and the kind of academic and also non-academic spaces. My sense is that they are always fighting for funding, and that part of what we should be doing as institutions is figuring out really great ways to partner and collaborate, but not necessarily consume. So I feel like those spaces need funding just as much as they always have, maybe more.
Allan, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end, I think.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, both of us, for taking the time. I hope you
so
enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. I think basically I walk away feeling very positive about our future.
And Scott, thank you. I love Allan, and it's such a pleasure to get to sit with you both.
Thank you very much.
Total pleasure.
See you soon. Thank you, both of you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.